Chapter 34 is your formal introduction to deponent verbs. Just a reminder, active verbs are when the subject of the sentence is the agent of the verb. A passive verb is when the subject of the sentence is the patient of the verb. That is, in an active sentence, the subject is doing the verb. In a passive sentence, the subject is receiving the action of the verb. So a deponent verb is a verb where the verb is passive in form, but is translated as active in meaning. That is, the subject, usually picked out, in normal contexts with a nominative. The subject is going to be the agent of a verb that looks passive. Nice thing about this is there's basically no new forms to learn. Now, you have to get used to seeing the three principal parts, and there's a slight quirk there, I suppose. The three principal parts of a deponent verb are going to have, of course, your first person singular passive, and then your passive infinitive, which is exactly what you'd expect. It's the equivalent, the functional equivalent of the principal parts as found in a normal verb. This is also true of the third principal part. The third principal part is usually your perfect, right? Your first person singular perfect. How do you form a perfect of a deponent verb? You're going to use the passive. And the passive perfect system is your fourth principal part, your perfect passive participle, plus the verb to be. And so, what it kind of looks like, although this has presented it a little bit different with the verb to be there, but what it more or less looks like is it looks like they're giving you the fourth principal part as the third. That's not really what's going on, right? They're giving you the perfect active as the third principal part, which looks like the perfect passive for a deponent verb, because they're active verbs that look passive, right? So, totally predictable. And of course, there's no fourth principal part, because there is no way to spell the passive, to create a passive for a deponent verb, because they're already passive. So beyond that, the forms are normal. The forms are exactly what you'd expect for the passives. This textbook, if unless I'm mistaken, hasn't actually ever given you, however, the imperative. I'm going to come back to participles in a second. Let's talk about the imperative real quick. The imperative of the passive, or if they have, we haven't talked about it much. And the imperative of the passive is a little strange. The second person singular imperative passive looks identical to the active infinitive. So R-E, right? Thematic vowel R-E. Amere. Mare. Audere. Is the example given. Gaudere. Oh, hold on. I need to... Let's see here. I guess it's right there. Sequere. So, this is actually nice for deponents. So it's usually kind of annoying, because it usually looks like you've got an infinitive, and you have to use context to figure out whether that's an infinitive or a second person singular passive imperative, which in the passive with passive meaning, not very common, right? So usually it's the infinitive, that's sort of the default, and when you're totally confused, you think, oh yeah, this could be a second person singular passive imperative. This could be a command in the passive. But for deponents, it's actually kind of nice, because, of course, this form, sequere, looks like an active infinitive, but there is no active infinitive for deponent verbs, right? Because they use the passive infinitive, sequeri, or is it sequi for this one? They use, anyways, the passive infinitives. Let's see, let's go up and find it. Where is the infinitive? They use the passive infinitives. Yeah, it's sequi. It's the shortened form for the passive infinitive. Right. Oops. Right there. So sequi is the passive infinitive, which they use to create the active infinitive, which means sequere can't be anything else, right? It can't be anything other than the imperative, because this active infinitive form doesn't exist. They use the passive. It's a deponent, right? So that's actually not very hard. The second person plural imperative, let's see if I can get it on the screen here, is identical to the second person plural passive indicative, right? Mini. So horta mini, fata mini, pata mini, right? So we have the imperatives are not new forms. One is identical to the active infinitive, but that doesn't exist because it's deponent. And one is just simply a biform, straight up biform. Biforms are when you have two different ways to grammatically interpret a particular spelling. We've seen this a couple places. I guess the biggest, most obvious one is the future perfect and the perfect subjunctive, right? So, there's your deponent system. Passives with active meaning, slightly strange infinitives, or imperatives. There is this annoying class of semi-deponent verbs. Oh, we forgot participles. So, participles, they present this in a not at all intuitive way. They present participles. They give you a list of the exceptions for, where is it? They give you a list of exceptions for the participle. There it is. There's your list of exceptions for the deponent participle. That these, for deponent verbs, they're telling you right here that these deponent rules don't apply to these exceptions. Why is this silly? Because this is like all of them. It's much easier to learn this the other way around, which is deponent verbs are not deponent in the participle, except for the perfect passive. That's the one that's not listed there. So, the perfect passive participle is perfect active in meaning. There is no perfect active participle anywhere in Latin, except for the deponent, the perfect passive participle of the deponent. All the rest of the participles are exactly as they present. They are what they look like. The future active, the present active, and the future passive are all exactly what they would appear to be. So thinking of those as all a big class of exceptions to deponent rules is silly, when you could just say all participles are exactly what they appear to be in the deponent system, except for the perfect passive participle, which is active in meaning. See, value added for these videos, right? The last thing in this chapter, there's these semi-deponents. Read these are pretty straightforward. Basically, they're only deponent in the perfect system. So the present system, they're normal. So present system includes the present, the future, whereas in the perfect system, also the imperfect. These systems are terribly named, but the present, the imperfect, and the future are the present system. I would have called them the incomplete system, as opposed to the perfect system, wherein they function as deponents. So the first example there, note, hortati sunt is the third person plural, perfect, passive, indicative. Sed contra, it's a deponent, semi-deponent, in the perfect system. So this perfect passive is in fact active in meaning. Lastly, the so-called ablatives with special deponents. These are words that take an ablative as its direct object, and they happen to be deponent. These are probably good candidates. So the one they highlight is utor, to use, is going to take an ablative, which of course has to come from the instrumental use of the ablative, that the verb of using is going to take as its direct object the case you put things into when you're using them, right? And utor also happens to be deponent. So they give you a couple more examples. I think these probably all fall into similar. There are probably similar explanations for each of these. But, take a look. These are important. More important is just to remember utor takes an ablative. And you'll see there are a handful of verbs in this language that take direct objects in other cases. This is one of them. Just learn it.